Good morning, and thank you for joining us for day 2 of the Illinois Education and Success Network Conference. I'm Edith Juguna, and I'm the Network Director. We had a great first day yesterday that included announcing our new name. This new name reflects our purpose and vision beyond 2025 and our goal to renew our commitment to equity and the mission of the network. Yesterday, we also heard from students, national leaders, and state and local partners on a wide range of topics. I learned about new ways to think about and do my work, and connected with some new people, and I hope you did also. Today, we kick off the conference with a conversation on understanding critical race theory and addressing equity in education. Our hope is to shed light on this often misunderstood concept and to arm ourselves with information and tools to consider how we more equitably serve students in our communities. We're very fortunate to have someone who has done extensive work and research on this topic, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot from him. I'll now turn it over to you, Dr. Miguel Saucedo, who's the Director of Postsecondary Strategic Interventions in Chicago Public Schools.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Special thank you to both Heather and Edith for the warm invitation. So I know we go back from our past experience of being an instructor to Heather, and then really she was able to be part of one of my CRT classes that I taught at Northeastern about a year or two ago, and then she invited me to this opportunity to speak. So thank you for that. Before I get started, I also want to give a sincere thank you to all the Illinois Education Career Success Network Committee for putting this conference together. I know it is a ton of work, and there's a large number of individuals attending. So kudos on the good work and making this event happen. As I kick off the introduction, I want to just give you the title, and then I'll jump into my formal introduction of who I am and what I do. So I'm Dr. Miguel Saucedo. I am the Director of Post-Secondary Strategic Interventions for Chicago Public Schools. And today I will be presenting an overview of CRT and addressing equity in education and providing some examples here at CPS, things of what we're doing. Next. Okay, let me jump in. So I said I was gonna do a little bit of justice to myself and share a little bit about my background, given that I hardly ever acknowledge where I come from or the attributes or the qualities or the skills that I have learned throughout this college tenured career. So I'll kick it off first with my family. So I am the youngest of 9 children. Mexican parents, born and raised in Little Village. I still live in that neighborhood. I attended 3 different high schools. To name them, it's Cristo Rey, Fergus Career Academy, and Holy Trinity. I was a product of the zero tolerance policy, so I got kicked out of 2 of those schools before I went off to my last high school where I graduated back in 2004. I had the opportunity to attend college. So I did go to the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I was able to get 3 of my degrees. So I was able to major in political science and Latino studies for my bachelor's degree. In that process, I did also become a McNair Scholar, which really led me to my graduate life. So in graduate school, I majored in educational policy studies as well as Latino studies. During my tenure in my graduate life was that I actually did a lot of research on the school to prison pipeline for Mexican boys and men, more generally boys and men of color, in particular to the school to prison pipeline and how the zero tolerance policy contributed to the push out of students. And the majority of them being African-American and Latino, along with our diverse learners. While I was in college, I did master a bunch of different student support services roles. So I worked as a research assistant, as a teaching assistant, as a graduate advisor, as a alumni coordinator, as a academic advisor. And in addition, I also, when I came back to do my research back in Chicago, which was here in my neighborhood, I was able to get super involved with community-based organizations, where I also was able to master a lot of those skills in the sense of grant writing, not-for-profit management, community organizing, youth advocacy, among other skills in the CBO world. After that, I was able to get recruited by CPS to serve as their Director of Strategic Partnerships and Special Populations. That title changed about a year ago. Now it's Director of Postsecondary Strategic Interventions. In CPS, what I do is that I manage university partnerships through the College Compact, which I'll share a little bit later. And I also oversee all the student support services for our priority populations, in particular, African-American males, Latinx males, undocumented students. There's a whole nother list of individuals that I want to identify a little later in the middle of our presentation. The other thing that I do on my part-time is that I am an adjunct professor for both Northeastern and Lewis University. I only teach one class per semester. That is where I met Heather when I was able to teach CRT at Northeastern a while back. So I'm going to jump in right into the agenda for the day, which is going to be an overview of CRT. I'll probably take around 5-10 minutes to share this. I also have a short video to share with you. Then I'm going to lead us into some of the practices that we've been doing here in CPS and really just give you 4 key examples of how we've been implementing really our ideas, our practices, our priorities, and how we resolve some of these issues that we have while trying to organize these different strategic plans for our priority populations. In addition, I'm going to share a few tools and resources and future events that are taking place. So I want to share so that way you can also take advantage of attending these events and or taking advantage of these resources. At the end, I'll leave around 10 minutes for us to just ask questions and reflect together, hoping that we have a little bit of dialogue to present. So before we get started, I want to just share the history of CRT. So in this book, which is most recent, in Lindsay Perez-Huber, along with Susana Munoz, one of their direct quotes is that CRT theory finds its origin in critical legal studies. This happened back in the 70s and the 80s. And they use this conceptual tools of counter storytelling and the pervasiveness of racism, whiteness as property, interest convergence, critique of liberalism, and the intersectionality to center race and racism as a means to understanding structural and systemic inequities. So some of our founding fathers or founding individuals, people who really developed CRT since the inception, and this is all the way from the Frank Valdez to the Delgado, Richard Delgado, Gene Stefanik, Kimberly Crenshaw, Eric Bell, Daniel Solorzano, Tarayoso, along with many others. I know Cheryl Harris, along with a bunch of other, which I'll share right now, just a little bit of the literature review behind CRT, really the ones that really develop from the legal studies and try to apply it to see how we can actually start taking this legal framework into the space of education. So in CRT and education, we have these tenets that we really live by in the sense of the things that we believe and the way we see the world. And the way, as we analyze these policies, is the way that we use this framework to be able to really deconstruct some of these things that we see as neutral. So let me break it down. These are like the 5 pillars that really hold CRT together. So one, and this is coming from Gloria Lansing-Billing along with David Stovall, and as well as many other scholars. Towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to share around 100 different scholars that I basically wrote down their names so that way you can continue to do some research on these individuals and really those different types of frameworks along with the CRT family tree, which I'll share in a minute. So first and foremost, really is to name and discuss the pervasive daily reality of racism in US society, which in turn disadvantage people of color. So that's like the first premise of CRT. That is the primary tenet of what CRT scholars believe. Secondly, is to expose and deconstruct the seemingly race-neutral, colorblind policies that really entrench the desperate treatment of people of non-white persons. I'll share an example of that in a minute. The third point is to legitimize and promote the voices and narratives of people of color as sources of critique to the dominant social order, which purposely devalues their story, their history, their origins, their culture, all of these things. Fourth is to revisit the civil rights and liberalism to address the inability to dismantle, expunge discriminatory social political relationships. Last is to change and improve the challenges to race-neutral and multicultural movements in education, which have made white students' behavior the norm. So we often compare other priority groups, other minorities to whites. So when we talk about the achievement gap, it is always in comparison to white students. So white students, let's just say, are the status quo. That is the norm in the US society. That is what, since the inception of the US, they have been many Americanization programs to really compare from Native Americans to African Americans to Latinx and everyone else, other people of color who have been compared to white students or the success of white students. And as I was just sharing a little bit earlier about my research with the school to prison pipeline, the policy that I analyzed was a zero tolerance policy. And in this case, when politicians create these policies, which really happened in the turn of the war on drugs in the late 80s and the early 90s, everyone, I mean, you can't really argue with someone who's saying, yes, we don't want guns, we don't want drugs in schools, we don't want violence in schools. And that's the reason why we all, quote unquote, advocated for a zero tolerance school discipline policy across the district, across the nation. So because school districts are funded by the federal government, if you do not implement the zero tolerance policy in public schools, then you run the risk of not receiving funds. So in this case, even though the policy seems like a colorblind policy and it seems neutral, we know that after years of research and decades of individuals being impacted, we know that African American and Latinx boys have been impacted, along with our diverse learners, have been impacted disproportionately by this zero tolerance or race neutral or colorblind policy. So that's just one example. There's a million other examples that we have used in the sense of they might seem as colorblind and neutral, but when we start talking about practice and implementation, we start to see that there's some, again, disproportionately appropriation or implementation of this policy towards minority populations. I'm gonna continue moving on to the next slide. And this is a little bit around like from our historical leaders, really the founding individuals who really brought CRT to life in the 80s. So from Derek Bell, from the Faces at the Bottom of the Well, to David Stovall, who is more recent. I know he's still a little older, but nonetheless, some of his work is more prevalent in the sense that it's current, up-to-date examples. For instance, the struggle of Little Village Lando High School and how he applies housing, ed policy, segregation, gentrification, really in the lens through CRT framework of how we can analyze school segregation, how we can think about how schools are funded, what populations or priority populations or demographics attend that school, the fight for that school, the hunger strike that took place in order for us to create that school. All of these things are really, I want to connect them from the 80s all the way to the 2020s. In addition, these are just like there's 100 or 1,000 other books that you can read on. These are the ones that I just handpick because they're some of the most like primer books that you should right away get your hands on, in the sense of these are must-haves. And really just gives you an overview of some of the things as to how it started and then how it started to branch off from the origins of CRT. So Critical Race Theory and Introduction by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanik are really some of the critical books that really founded and created the pathway for CRT scholars to continue to do this work and expand on the theory of CRT. For instance, Daniel Solorzano and Lindsay Perez-Huber from California have been some of the really prominent CRT scholars in California that have really took some of this work to the next forefront as cutting edge research in regards to, for instance, students attending predominantly white institutions and having to deal with micro-racial aggressions on campus. Now, I know we have different stakeholders here today, from K-12 to higher education to community-based organizations to funders. Microaggressions happen in everyday experiences. they do not happen solely on a college campus. They happen at the workplace, they happen in K-12, they happen in the community when police officers are harassing certain individuals in the streets. It happens when campus police officers or administrators, faculty members, students of one race discriminates and really makes other students of color feel unwelcome, unsafe, really makes you feel like you don't belong on campus or that you're inferior. So those are the type of things that Sororzano and Perez Huber highlight, and some of the things that we ourselves as professionals can start counter attacking or counter arguing or really creating alternatives for how to deal with everyday racism. One of their insights is that we need to be more affirmative. So when we start talking about how we minimize an individual's identity, for instance, a microaggression, a direct way for us to counter that is by creating micro affirmations, almost acknowledging the language of that individual, the identity of the individual, the culture, the history of oppression, really is a way for us to really create a sense of community and a sense of dialogue where we can actually communicate about some of the issues that we've been struggling with. As you can tell, a lot of individuals have a hard time talking about race and racism. These are some of the topics that really can get us to start, one, analyzing it from different perspectives, but also thinking about ways to how to solve and problem solve through some of these everyday experiences. Some of the other things that Tarayoso has been able to branch out was the capital of cultural wealth to the counter stories of, yes, there is a dominant story out there of, let's say, for instance, immigrants. We as CRT scholars really are trying to counter those narratives or counter those arguments with our own narrative, that's the reason why they call it counter narratives. So Tarayoso really kind of brings us to light in the sense of with CRT or LACRIT, and in particular with Latinx and Chicano students in the educational pipeline. So she's able to really just bring CRT to light, applies it to this particular population, and really shows you the aftermath of the impact of these supposedly colorblind policies that really serve to disadvantage people of color. Next slide. I know it gets a little confusing about what is the basis. I kind of shared the 5 different pillars of the tenets of CRT. In addition to that, I want you to think that CRT was our founding grounding theory that brought all of these different family members together. So as CRT started, we started to see that there was this very black and white binary as to how we analyze literature, how we analyze history. And then these different groups of scholars started to expand on that theory and really start identifying the specific needs for every population. I pulled one example out of this one, and I used LACRIT. So as you can tell, all of these different theories or crits are really based off of a particular identity group that falls under the family of CRT. So Black critical theory, Latino critical theory, Asian critical theory, tribal crit, white crit, feminist crit, queer crit, disability crit. These, and among others, there's other critical theories out there that are starting to expand this family tree. But I'm going to give this quote, and then I'm going to give you an example of what I found online to kind of almost give you another example of how all this comes together. So LACRIT is guided by the same tenets as CRT. So we come from the same roots, we come from the same values, we come from the same ideas as CRT. CRT is the glue that holds us together. But it also acknowledges issues specific to the Latino communities, such as immigration status, language, ethnicity, culture, phenotype. LACRIT allows for a more defined research focus and has led to the development of racist nativism. So here we're really trying to say, okay, even though we all agree on the CRT tenets, we also want to expand on that and say, there's particular things that have impacted the Latinx community. In this regard, let's think about the history of the conquest. And when we're talking about Latinx, we have to be inclusive of all the different ethnic groups that really make up what we call Latinx. So when we're talking about Latinx individuals, we're talking about Mexican Americans, we're talking about Puerto Ricans, Colombians, Dominicans, Cubans, Salvadorians. They all have their unique history, especially with this unique history in regards to US interventions policies. So from the dictators that each country had to the type of foreign policy that we had with them, like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement of 1994, like all of these things really have impacted these different populations. In that sense, they also want to acknowledge their history. So in this regard, like let's just think about Mexican Americans or Chicanos. They want to acknowledge the history of the conquest, which is the 1846 to 1848, the annexation of the Southwest states and or Mexico territory, which now became the US. They want to acknowledge that. They also want to acknowledge that Mexican Americans also had to follow the Jim Crow laws. They also picked cotton in South Texas. They also got lynched. They also were discriminated and segregated in every sense of the way. So you see, I just named housing, I named citizenship, I named language, I named all these different things that really pertain to one group. But in this case, almost every family tree has their own list of issues that they want to acknowledge and how they're impacted by US policy and how they're treated just overall in our country. So when we're talking about the Japanese Exclusion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Gentleman's Act, it was the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, these are all these different policies that happened 100 years ago. And even to this day, we still see hate crimes happening against Asian American students or Asian American residents, individuals. So like, we know that every population is being impacted by racist rhetoric, practices, and policies. Next. I have this little 2-minute video. Sometimes me speaking might not deliver or convey the message. So I said, let me look up one of our key scholars, Prudence Carter. In 2 minutes, she's gonna be able to give you the elevator pitch of what CRT is.
Let's just start with a basic definitional question. When you hear critical race theory over and over again, what should people understand? How do you define CRT?
So I first want to just make a distinction between CRT, which is a theoretical framework that I learned in graduate school and read about in graduate school, versus teaching about race and racism in American history critically. So critical race theory is a framework. It's a theoretical framework that was developed in the 1980s by legal scholars to help us understand how it is that structural and racial disparities endure in our society, and how that is actually engendered in some of our laws and policies. And so the idea was to get us to think systemically, as opposed to just thinking that racism manifests by individuals just mistreating each other, that there are actual structures in our society that create these different kinds of racial gaps and racial disparities economically, in terms of housing, in terms of education. And so that's what they do, is that they actually show us how the law, how laws that are supposed to be neutral actually can promulgate or support racial disparities. That's a theoretical framework. I think what we're talking about today, though, is some contestation and conflict over how you teach about race, racial hierarchies, critically, racism in schools and society. And so the two are being conflated.
And so when you hear people talking repeatedly about critical race theory, what is your thought?
Well, I hear people talking about critical race theory. I see that as a straw man for many communities, politicians particularly, trying to shape the knowledge base and what we teach students. I think that there is some fear about raising consciousness about structural inequality, about structural racism, because it does implicate many of our practices in our society. It indicates what we would have to do differently in government. And some of that is ideological, in terms of there's a lot of resistance to how we do things to be fairer and more just in our society. So there are a number of, I read a really good article just yesterday in the New Yorker about the origins of this conflict and who's behind it. And it's a concerted effort by many on the right to mitigate the extent to which we really augment and increase the understanding of racism in our society.
Can you go back one slide? I want to show you this family tree. And if you can click on the link right where it says family tree. And it's a website, it's the University of Denver. It literally breaks down it's like your annotated bibliography here for every framework. So these are the type of things that I would love for you to do some research and really start identifying these key scholars who are talking about these specific family trees or branches of CRT. Okay, we're ready to go back. And I'm gonna do a quick time check. I got 20 minutes left, so I'm gonna run through some of these examples. And again, it's a way just so that way you can see what we here at CPS, and really in particular our department, the Office of School Counseling and Post-Secondary Advising, are doing. So before I give you the examples, I want you to think of these three tenets or these three themes or these three ideas of intersectionality, targeted universalism, and critical race tenets. So the tenets that we just shared, the 5 of them in the beginning of the presentation, I want you to think of those as we start to develop models of supports for all of these priority groups. So as I mentioned earlier, yes, I am responsible for developing strategic priority population initiatives for these groups. So I'm gonna name them: African-American males, students with 2.0, 2.9 GPA, undocumented, refugees, English learners, diverse learners, students living in temporary living situations, justice-involved youth, immigrants, LGBTQIA+ students, Latinx males, are all of our list of individuals that we want to support. And we know that by identifying the data of the different metrics that we have for them, is identifying the gaps as to where they're lagging behind. 2, we have to work with our stakeholders to address these concerns and develop strategies for supporting them. And then 3 is actually the implementation of the work. Is now that you have these thoughts, now that you have the theory, let's apply the action. And in addition, ensuring that we have time to reflect about how to adjust and pivot and improve the practices that we're currently employing as we support these populations. Next. The first example I want to share with the College Compact is that we've been doing it for around 3-4 years now. This is the 3rd iteration of the College Compact. The main mission of the Compact is that, and this is part of our 5-year vision goal for CPS, is to increase the college enrollment rate of CPS graduates to 78% by 2024. The way we do that is strategically, we create these goals in communicating and problem solving with these colleges and universities. Currently, we have around 35 of them that we partner up in increasing the enrollment, persistency, and success rates of CPS graduates. So really the compact is our way of collaborating with our universities, and we do it through these 3 committees: admissions and enrollment, finance, and then student affairs and support services. The way we organize ourselves or structure ourselves is that we have 3 general committee meetings. They occur during September, November, and April. Our next one is April 1st. Also in about a month a month exactly. 2 is that we created these committees that really focus on the implementation of strategies to focus on whatever those goals are for the year. Every year we have different goals that we set ourselves up and that we really implement with our partners at these different various institutions of higher ed. During these 3 committee meetings, in between that, we meet as a committee to continue the work and do the follow-up of whether it's identifying the data, implementing strategies, creating landscape reports, and or doing student-facing or adult-facing programming. The last one is more of a one-on-one meetings that we have with our committee chairs and with the compact members. So in this case, if we have a meeting with the university, we have a one-on-one where we can discuss in detail some of the data metrics or data on African-American males, on Latinx males, on undocumented students, and what we can do to strengthen those support services, and or just in general, how to support you with recruitment or with retention of CPS students. And again, by supporting CPS students, but as a result, other students are also going to benefit by the creation of these programs or initiatives that you're going to help this particular group of students. Everyone benefits. And then overall, it's again, just discussing strategies for how to improve our relationship individually. So just think of that as like a lecture. Beginning is where we kind of give you high-level updates from CPS. Think of discussion, committee meetings. That's where the work gets done. And then third is like office hours, our individual one-on-one, where we actually get to troubleshoot in confidentiality, working with one team and the other without having to kind of air out any of our issues that we're struggling to resolve at our individual campuses. Next. Here's all the individual institutions that are involved. On the left side, you see the colleges and universities. On the right side, you see our college access partners. So in the college access partners, we have big conveners like the Illinois Association for College Admission Counseling at Systems. We also have ISAC, ELASFA, Ladder Up, 1 Million Degrees, the Network for Undocumented Scholarship Access, as well as other big conveners like Advance Illinois, America's Urban Campus, Illinois Board of Higher Ed, as well as PCC and To and Through Project. We compiled the report. Shout out to Bellwether Consulting for helping us develop this research project that we did during this past summer. So we know that we were in the middle of COVID, and we know that some institutions actually saw an increase in recruitment or enrollment and retention on their campus. So we started to analyze and really reach out to these 12 institutions and said, hey, can we have one-on-one interviews with you to capture what you're doing? Because we want to borrow these best practices and share them with other colleges and universities, so that way they too can start either creating and or expanding upon the services that they currently provide to students. So we split up the best practices within the 3 committees. First and foremost is the admissions and enrollment. Is that one is that they, again, these are best practices from higher eds to other higher eds. First is the increased accessibility and impact of campus visits. We know that we benefit. One is that we know if students actually go to visit the campus, research shows that they're more likely to graduate from college or be retained because they're exposed to those resources. So creating CPS specific events on your campus, giving them stipends for coming to visit, doing specialized admitted student orientation events, those are things that really make a difference. I know some of our schools are becoming test optional within our admission policies. These are things that a lot of other students benefit from, especially how controversial standard exams are. So I'm not going to get into that because I don't think we have enough time to get into that kind of worms. The other one is literally supporting our students with the application process. So this is everything from how to navigate your portal to getting the next steps in as far as like your housing deposit or anything that has to do with any paperwork that you have to submit, applications being waived, all of those things that really is just from getting you from point A to point B. There's a lot of steps in between there, and a lot of our students might be first generation, or their family and or the community and or the school counselors cannot support them or give them the enough attention and dedication to support them through that pathway. So we need universities as well to also step up and support our students with that transition. So again, as I was saying, we have to do everything from the placement exam to depositing your housing deposit, to scheduling a meeting with your academic advisor to register for classes. All of those things are essential for admissions and enrollment. The second one is finances. So we restructured and renamed this from financial aid to finance to be more inclusive of not just the financial aid aspect of finances for college, but really be inclusive of institutional aid, that individual universities have these kind of hidden buckets of money within their individual colleges, but also being able to be more intentional about scholarships and grants and all these other ways of how to fundraise or fund your college education. So by creating specific scholarships, like a CPS only scholarship, or creating emergency funds for students, really is a way for us to ensure their academic success because we're taking care of their finances. Financial stress is so severe that a lot of our students really end up leaving school before completion because of financial reasons. So one of the other best recommendations is to extend your tuition deadlines and or change the limits on whether it's $300, sorry, you can't register for next semester because you owe $300, extend that to $2,000, $3,000. The idea here is to continue to support our students with retention and graduation. Last one is that once we help our students complete their financial aid here in high school, once they're off in college, they're really on their own in completing financial aid in sophomore year, freshman year, junior year. So we also need a lot of support from our institutions to actually help them troubleshoot through that, as well as supporting them through the verification issues. We know that a lot of institutions are starting to see an increase in verification issues. We need assistance with that. Our school counselors are spread thin, so we really need, and I understand that higher eds are also spread thin, but these are the support services that the financial aid office really can help us deliver in supporting our students. And again, I know we all come from different institutions and we all have different types of award letters, but simplifying that, just so that way it's easy for the student and the parent to read, because I'll be honest, it's almost like another foreign language and or almost like tax code or all these different type of things that is really just hard for you to navigate because they're just structured differently. Sometimes we don't even differentiate direct from indirect cost. So some of these things is really a way for us to simplify our language and our communication to students to actually ensure that they're going to be financially in a good state while they're enrolling or sustaining in college. The last list of recommendations or best practices is that we need holistic advising. So I know some universities complain that this is not intrusive advising. I don't want to hold their hand. If they made it to college, they can manage on their own to survive college. That is not the approach we're trying to take. We need to be holistic in providing wraparound services, mentoring, career services, mental health, family engagement. I mean, really, we need to recruit the entire student and family and not just think of they have the academic rigor to succeed at this university. So I'm going to continue on. There's other things as far as like creating student support services or peer model supports. And like we just have transitional youth leaders that we're creating. The other thing is academic support. So we're talking about everything from tutoring to summer bridge camps to enrichment programs, as well as special needs like laptops. We know that that technology now under COVID is becoming even more of an issue. So again, we need to be proactive in supporting just the basic needs of our students. Next. Second example, here at CPS, we institutionalize all of these undocumented student services. So one is we have CAUSE, which is the Coalition of Advocates for Undocumented Student Education. That is made up, it's a coalition of a bunch of undocumented student clubs across the city. So these are Dreamer clubs, undocumented student clubs at various high schools that come together 2 times a month. So every other Saturday, we meet here in central office and we talk about everything from list of recommendations to CPS, to the demands that they have for CPS to create these resources in the schools, to creating a mandatory training for our school counselors and really other staff who are critical in their success in transitioning to college or to any other pathway that they're interested. We also created our own CPS scholarship, and we also organize other scholarship providers through NUSA, Network for Undocumented Scholarship Access. We have these 2 different events. One is the Dream Fund Scholarship. We have series of workshops where we really assist students in completing those scholarships. And we also host the annual NUSA Fair, which is the Scholarship and Financial Resource Fair that is open to families and communities. We do it every year at Arturo Velázquez Institute. Shout out to CCC for providing the space and for really being a thoughtful partner and really getting this work done. I'm going to show you this organizational flow chart of all the things that we have done within these past few years of really developing and expanding student support services for undocumented students. We partner with Office of Language and Cultural Education, along with OSCAPA, and we create all these different arms. So one is NUSA, our scholarship providers, and really other service providers. The Dream Team is really our fundraising arm. They are responsible for fundraising for the scholarship. The Dream High Team is responsible for student-facing direct student services. So we assist students with their applications, whatever applications are. Alternative applications, scholarships, college applications, the works. We also have an annual training that we do for school counselors primarily. And then again, we just mentioned calls. And then we partner with all these different organizations or state agencies like ISAC or Illinois Board of Higher Ed, Office of New Americans, ISARE, Chicago Law and Education Foundation to provide those legal services, tax services, know your rights, workshops or information. All of that, it's a holistic way of how to support our undocumented students. This same model is what we're trying to apply to the other priority groups that we have that we're going to start to develop these models for. Next. Third example is that we are starting to expand a bunch of our specialized fairs and student summits. So what do I mean by that? Is that one, this is our 9th year doing our Young Men of Color Summit. In this case, last year, we started our first ever Women of Color Summit for our students. Now, although these events usually take anywhere from 100 to 300 to 500 students, we are starting, now that we're not sure we're turning the corner on COVID, but now that we are re-engaging back in person and we're doing more in-person events, we are starting to recruit more individuals to that 200 to 300 mark. So every event, we're having hundreds of students come out and learning about each other, learning about coalition building, learning about how to become healthy, how to navigate their post-secondary pathways or whatever they want to do after high school. In addition, just to all these kind of wraparound services and resources that are available to them. So one of them we're doing it here at Truman College, CCC, at the Young Women of Color Summit, which will be done, it will take place in April. The other one is at UIC, which is the Mayo Summit, and that is going to be taking place at UIC on May 6th. Another example of these specialized fairs and student summits is the one I just mentioned, which is NUSA. We have our scholarship and financial resource fair. So there we recruit universities that provide scholarships to undocumented students. We recruit community-based organizations that offer a specific scholarship to a particular population or an area or a neighborhood of residents that they cater to. In addition, this is the annual Immigrant and Refugee Summit that is student-facing, and that takes place during the day. We're hosting it at Malcolm X this year. So shout out again to CCC for providing the space in the partnership. Last one is that, again, we know that not everyone goes to college and is not interested in going to college, that we need to be more intentional about expanding the pathways to students who are non-college bound. Some of the things we're doing with, shout out to the Roadmap Committee, to Maria Bucio with Learn, Fight, Succeed and her team of the next team, is that we're starting to expand some of these very trade-focused, non-college pathway fairs. So in this case, we did an event here at a Daily College where it was their manufacturing specialized tour, where we literally were able to do more of an experimental like experience or tour of the campus and be able to almost experience a mock class, so that way students can actually feel the equipment, see the equipment, talk to other students who are enrolled in the program to share their testimonies about the benefits of enrolling in a trades program. We also have the Skills Trades Career Fair that will take place over 3 days and in about 2 weeks. And this is in partnership with City Hall or the Mayor's Office. And this is, again, open to all high schools, and the capacity is like 3,000 individuals. So we are starting to really cater to these other pathways that we have been doing a disservice to, just because, you know, I understand we are really, you know, motivated and interested and supportive in the college track, but we also have to be mindful about dedicating time and resources to these other pathways. Next example. This is the last example, and I know I only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to start, wrapping it up and concluding and giving my last comments. Is that I gave you 3 examples. This is the one that I would say is equally important, but it's more internal. So at OSCAPA, that's what we call ourselves, the Office of School Counseling and Post-Secondary Advising. We were able to, one, create this model of whose work, our work, to embody that we are all in it together. regardless of whatever priority population that we're focusing on, we are all in type of mentality and supporting this work. And that even though one population or one work stream or one team is responsible for X, Y, and Z, it is everyone's responsibility to support all of CPS students across the district and really wherever they go off in their post-secondary endeavors, pathways, careers, professions. The way we did that was that we restructured our priorities based off of some data metrics and some analysis, and also some reteaming of the teams that we have here to be more reflective, to be balanced out, and to really reflect the work rivers that we have within our department. We also were able to hire 2 college and career equity specialists, so shout out to Carlos Munoz and Art Shanks. They are both licensed social workers, veterans in the CPS field, in the post-secondary field, and the mental health field, and really bringing us, they are the 2 individuals that are going to start creating and leading some of our African-American male and Latinx male priority population initiatives. We also hired our undocumented champion program manager. This is the first time ever CPS was able to create a full-time employee position who we hired to Santa Mares to actually oversee all of the things that we do for undocumented students. As I shared 2 slides, it is a massive amount of work for one individual. So Santa Mares is now tasked with leading that work. In addition, we also were able to, for the first time ever, launch 56 school-based mentoring across CPS, both elementary and in high schools. Cheryl Howard-Neal is the project manager for school-based mentoring. So as you can tell, we went from college and career equity to undocumented students to mentoring. These are full-time employees who have been hired to lead this work. We also, as a district, really CPS leadership, we were trained on the CPS equity framework, which the Office of Equity is really the ones in charge of creating the equity framework and training every department. We also, as a CPS leadership and as the OSCAPA team, we all got trained on Bias Sync, which is an online training that was offered to the school district. Internally, as OSCAPA, we created a folder of resources, tools, videos, readings to continue our professional growth as we talk about these different ideas and theories and practices. About 2-3 years ago, I took my boss to the Critical Race Studies and Education Conference over here in University of Southern California, where Sean Harper was able to host at the Center for Race and Equity. This past year, I was able to take 4 other OSCAPA team members to the most recent conference that took place at the University of Delaware. And in those conferences is really our exposure to meet the veteran and the new CRT scholars who are talking about all these different theories and ideas and really practices and or implementations that they have been doing, and really just sharing best practices of how to navigate equity in higher ed, equity in K-12, or really just equity in general. And then we will also be hosting our CRT scholar, Dr. David Stovall, at one of our monthly PDs, which I'll share in a minute. Go ahead next. So we hired Praxis Institute to actually do monthly PDs on the equity framework, on intersectionality, and some of the tenets that really borrows from ethnic and gender women studies, and really start breaking them down and applying them to the different priority groups that we have here. As you can see, some of the priority groups here in the modules. Next. As I was mentioning in the CRT conference, this just happened in October of 2021, on the 27th and through the 29th at the University of Delaware. The website is here. Shout out to the CRT Planning Committee. They have a tentative date for October 26th to the 28th at Southern Illinois, Edwardsville. So it's in our backyard. Please save the date. Stay tuned on the website so you can find out how to register, and really so that way you can almost do your own research and attend these sessions and hear from the CRT scholars themselves about what they're up to and the new direction that the CRT family tree is going. Next. I told myself, I started trying to create all these citations and all the annotated bibliography. And I said, you know what, I'd rather just list the top, and this is by no means a top 100 scholars, it's just 100 scholars there's another 900 of them and counting. So I wrote down all these individuals' names. Feel free to do your own research and start really believing them from their own voice and from their own literature instead of just hearing it from me as a practitioner. Next. All yours. We have 8 minutes left and I'm opening up for Q&A. Thank you, everybody. And again, a sincere thank you to all the committee members for organizing this, and another sincere thank you to Heather and Edith for working with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Saucedo, for that really informative presentation. Really appreciated the examples. There's lots of love for you in the chat and lots of good comments about how people are very appreciative of the work. So there's a couple of questions in the Q&A, and some of them are really related to pushback against this work. There's a question about, could you comment whether or not CRT is being taught in CPS? And should we push back against this, or should we just accept that the terminology of CRT is being misused and continue to push for racial equity? And there's a couple of other questions around dealing with obstacles and pushback.
Absolutely, CRT is not being taught in CPS, so period. However, we are just studying the theory as a way for us to expand the way we think, though as we're creating policies. And again, if we mentioned, one of the tenets was for us to actually tap into the stories and to the experiences of our students. So although CPS and or Chicago looks very different than the state of Illinois, we want to remind you that CPS is a majority minority school district. So typically it's like 37% African-American, 47% Latinx. 85–90% of the school district is minority. So it's a different type of conversation when we're talking about even our teacher population is more than 50% white. So when you're going to come into a large school district like CPS, which is the third largest in the country, and you don't want to talk about race or racism, removing CRT, let's just remove those words, those 3 key words. Let's remove them and just talk about race and racism. If we don't want to acknowledge the past, and yet we're trying to serve people of color and don't want to acknowledge the impact that slavery or conquest of the history of conquest, the history of colonization, and we start to see and or not see because we have our blinders on, that is going to do a disservice to students. So I don't want you to, again, as Ms. Dr. Prudence Carter told you, don't conflate the teaching of race and racism to CRT. CRT is a framework, it's an idea. Even in our own internal department, even when we attended the CRT conference, people came back with, I have more questions than answers. I'm having a hard time understanding this. So it's not that everybody in CPS adopted CRT. We don't even teach it. We are barely grappling with the idea of deconstructing what it really means. And even if it's applicable, can we apply it? Can we think of it as a guiding idea as we start to do youth organizing work? So say, for instance, if we want to go and really start tapping into our young African-American males, are you going to develop policies and practices on their behalf without asking them? So I want you to don't fall into this kind of rabbit hole of CRT and you're teaching hate and you're teaching like these misconceptions about how the US was construed or built. Let's be honest. We are in stolen land. We are all immigrants other than indigenous and First Nation tribes. They are the first inhabitants of this continent. If we don't want to acknowledge how the genocide of Native Americans or First Nations, and yet we want to teach our young people in CPS or across the district or across the country without acknowledging that past, we are doing a disservice to ourselves and to them.
Thank you for that. There is a related question about how to address or correct the myths. about CRT being taught in schools. It's related to the first question.
Please, please, please stop watching YouTube. Don't look up the videos that come out in the top 10 like search box. Go look at the 100 scholars that I just shared. Go look at their biographies, go look at the numerous books and articles and publications, so that way you can literally see it from a scholarly standpoint, and don't follow what some of our politicians are hearing from hearsay or from the public rhetoric or whatever, wherever they're receiving this propaganda about the myths of CRT. Please be critical and don't fall into this rabbit hole of hearing whatever you hear, whether it's on the radio, on the TV, because 9 times out of 10 is probably not true. I would rather you go and do your own research. Please don't lean or focus or depend on a public radio for you to get your current information or your news feed from Facebook or whatever other means of communication where you're receiving this misinformation.
All right, there's also a question about how the strategies you talked about were identified and prioritized.
Yeah, so we know that in every metric, so we have our KPI, which is key performance indicators. That's one of our data. It's not all of it, and I don't want to use data to reflect the plight of our African-American and Latino male students. But we know that based off that metric by itself, which is the number of college applications, FAFSA completion, and scholarship applications, we know that they're lagging behind every other racial group and or gender group in CPS. So based off of data, start analyzing, are these the common trends that are happening? And again, what are some key things that we can start, one, revisiting and reflecting upon our practices, whether they're doing a disservice or a service to our students, and what are some of the things that we can control within our own locus of control to actually change those policies or practices to better serve our students. So in this case, think of creating student clubs. Think of engaging students and families about how to inform your practices. If you're in the middle of developing a strategic plan for a priority group, please make sure you check in with the people who are going to be impacted the most. So in this case, just to bring it back to Derek Bell, the faces at the bottom of the well, or those populations at the margins, and that you're developing ideas or practices or policies, make sure you check in with them before you implement that, because you might be doing a disservice to that group of individuals, because if you don't have equal representation or representation from that group in your planning and designing of your project, you are doing it wrong. That is not the way to go. You need to have the people who are being impacted the most at the table to make decisions with you, whether they have a PhD or a GED. You need to have them at the table, and that is the real way of how to organize and make change happen at the most. These are the 2 tenets that I'm going to leave you with. This is one of my scholars that I really, really love and appreciate, and I learned so much about. Dolores Delgado Bernal had these 2 values. One is that as you do research, as you do your scholarship, as you do your day-to-day work, follow these 2 values. And whatever you do, make sure you are in solidarity with the people you're working with. So if that's students, if that's teachers, if that's parents, in solidarity, so work with them. 2, be reciprocal. Reciprocity is a 2-way street. It cannot be where you're just taking stories and you're doing whatever is in the best interest for you, your organization, or your institution. The idea here is to be reciprocal. What are you doing for students? What are you doing for community members or for parents? It cannot just be this research of just taking and doing this helicopter research and or really excavating the stories of the people who are the most vulnerable, the people who are at the margins, and then you go and publish a report, you go publish and make a presentation, you get paid $5,000 for an honorarium, while the people who got impacted and that you took their stories and portrayed it and shared it and published it, how are they benefiting from your research? How are they benefiting from the policies that you're implementing? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Saucedo. And that's a fantastic point to end on, ensuring that we are engaging those for whom we are making change. This was a really provocative and informative session, as I knew it would be, and I really appreciate the tools you offered, and we look forward to digging into them more deeply. For the questions we didn't get to, we will share them with Dr. Saucedo and we'll respond to them. So today we have 3 breakout sessions from 10:30 to 11:30 and from 1 to 2. And at 2:30, we have a session on student voices where you'll hear directly from members of our Student Advisory Council on how they are navigating the education system. So I encourage you to join the rest of the sessions. And thanks again for joining us today. And Dr. Saucedo, thank you very much.